Social connection is the key to a healthy life and a great longevity.
Social connection in the United States is now like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but no one does anything about it. Japan, Singapore, Korea, Spain, and Italy, countries that are far ahead of us in terms of healthy aging and longevity.
And I think you really argue in the book that these social ties, the ties that bind us in our homes and our communities, are sometimes a better predictor than diet or exercise.
And I found out that social connection there is not only sort of at the top of the list of what people and society talks about in relation to healthy aging, that they've created what you might call a social health infrastructure that helps people stay socially connected, purposeful, and living meaningful lives as they age. I intend to encourage everyone else to have the same ambition for those next 20, 30 years as you did when you were 30 or 40.
If those pivots don't come because of our hyper-partisan politics these days, what can individuals be doing now to prepare for a future where healthcare might cost more?
It starts, I think, with
Social connection is the key to a healthy life and a great longevity. I'm Bradley Sherman, and this is Population Next. And on today's show, we're with Ken Stern. He's the author of a new book called Healthy to 100. It's an exploration of what we're doing wrong here and right sometimes in the United States and what nations around the world are getting right. This conversation goes through what's working, what's not, how people can think about their lives differently, and what our communities can better do to prepare us for what's next. Ken, welcome to Population Next.
Bradley, thanks for having me on.
It's so good to see you, and I am so excited about your new book. I have to say it fed into some of my own bias about social connection and how important that is. And I think you really argue in the book that these social ties, the ties that bind us in our homes and our communities, are sometimes a better predictor than diet or exercise. Tell me a bit about what you found on your travels around the world to actually bolster this claim.
So let's start off. I think people have generally started to catch on in the U.S. that social connection matters to health. Maybe not quite at the level that it deserves, but I think social connection in the United States is now it's like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but no one does anything about it. What I found in my travels around the world, so I went to, as you know, Bradley, I went to 5 countries for my book, Healthy to 100. And Japan, Singapore, Korea, Spain, and Italy, countries that are far ahead of us in terms of healthy aging and longevity. And I found out that social connection there is not only sort of at the top of the list of what people and society talks about in relation to healthy aging, they're doing things about it, that they've created what you might call a social health infrastructure that helps people stay socially connected, purposeful, and living meaningful lives as they age.
And this is really from the start of life, right? This isn't something that they just bring about when you turn 50.
That's right. So my book largely focuses, I tend to write books about myself. So, I'm 62, so I tend to think about people in my age cohort, 50, 60, 70s. But, healthy aging starts really at birth. In fact, it starts before birth. So the idea of keeping people socially connected through the generations, something that's deeply embedded in these many societies. And in fact, one of the things that was universal in all these societies that actually surprised me a bit was the importance they attach to intergenerational connections. So it's not just, hey, let's keep the young folks connected and keep the old folks connected. Let's actually keep them connected to each other. And there are actually a lot of policies and approaches and cultural norms built around that don't exist here in the United States.
Did you find that some of this is simply by the design of the community itself, not just the social infrastructure, but actually the hard infrastructure, the buildings, the way communities and neighborhoods are built?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of physicality that goes into social connection. So I'll give you 2 examples of that. One in Spain, in Barcelona, I visited the super blocks. And I think they would probably, social connection is in the lexicon of a lot of societies. It's less in it's in the air in Spain. It's less in actually talk about the super blocks are places where they closed it to the blocks, the urban areas to cars. They made pedestrian ways. They put benches out, allow people. It's very hard to socially connect when you're whizzing by each other in cars and probably giving each other the finger. They create physical infrastructure to allow people to connect. And they do. You can walk down this, what are formerly streets, now are essentially large sidewalks, and people are at park benches, they're at tables, they're playing soccer in the streets. It's a very different field that is part of the hard physical infrastructure. And then in Singapore, which is, I think, probably the most interesting healthy aging country in the world, one of the things they've done is essentially create, they started off actually trying to make sort of senior housing the center of neighborhoods. So we have a way of essentially having what some people call age apartheid here in the States. I think it's a little strong, but separating the generations physically. They have places where they bring the generations together by making senior housing sort of the hubs of the neighborhoods, putting stores and restaurants around them. And then they decided that wasn't enough, and they got rid of the concept of senior housing and essentially created a housing policy in which every building is intended to have the generations together, and design playgrounds and walking courses so that they were sure to keep the generations together. So there's very much a physical aspect of these societies that drive social connection for sure.
And if I'm not mistaken, Singapore's also made a real effort to at least include multi-generational households, even though they're not under one roof in the same building too. Is that true?
That is true. So Singapore is both the best example and the worst example. And it's the best example because it's a society that is most at all levels of society, from government to individuals, sort of committed to this idea of social connection and healthy aging, and that as a key goal of society. It's the worst example because it is the government commands aspects of the economy that most countries don't. So one thing they do is they command housing. So 90% of the housing in the country is owned by the government. And leased out to citizens, and that gives them tremendous leverage over who lives where. So, for one thing, they do is you can't, as a single person, you're ineligible for your own apartment until you're 35. So that keeps the families together in one roof by supply and demand. The other thing is they give most housing goes by lottery, but they give priority to houses that are that keep families together close by. So when I was there under the auspice of the National University of Singapore, and one of my minders, one of my tour guides, was a young woman who lived just below her in-laws, and that wasn't an accident. That was a result of the priority they got by living very close to each other. And they had a kid, so they had built-in caregiving. They could take care of their aging parents. It was and they didn't have to live together. So it actually worked out very well in that particular case.
Now, obviously, we have quite a different system of government here, less
yes.
less autocratic and less dense. Maybe the closest thing to Singapore in the U.S. is maybe New York City. But given that difference, and I'm sure that there are people listening to this saying, that's a Singaporean way, that's a Japanese way, that's a Spanish way. What could we apply here? Because it seems like our era of suburban development is coming to a point where people are realizing it doesn't quite work for us. It's actually putting up barriers to our long-term health and success and longevity.
Yeah. So I would actually argue it's less their way, because I think the way I just described, not quite the specifics of Singapore, but other countries, it's actually mostly the global way. The U.S. is different from the rest of the world. So it's really the American way that has divided generations, make it harder. And suburbia is one, just by the physical layout, the lack of density makes it harder for people to connect. The 55 plus community, which doesn't really exist anywhere but the U.S. So they have roughly 4 million older Americans living in age-restricted housing. That doesn't specifically makes it impossible to have intergenerational housing or intergenerational families. That doesn't exist in other countries. So we have developed a culture that really divides the generations. You're more likely to have a friend in the US, more a friend of a different race than you are to have one that's 10 years younger or older than you. We've made almost a fetish of the idea that we should be divided by age. So I think there is a little bit of, I think, a snapback going on. I think you're describing something that has to do with just the incredible cost of housing and the lack of affordable housing and the need to create more density, which naturally puts people together in greater connection. And that will have, I think, a positive effect. One of the places it's not, I mentioned in passing in the book, one of the places I've seen in the United States, which actually has great healthy aging, is Co-op City in the Bronx, which is the world's largest co-op development, thousands and thousands of units. It's the largest NORC, naturally occurring retirement community in the United States and maybe the world. And the reason why people age so well in Co-op City is because it is affordable in New York City, and people move there and they don't leave. They sometimes pass it on to generations, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. But that naturally creates community. You know your neighbors because they've been there for 30 years. You know, you have groups that are set up that people have deeply embedded relationships. That creates, that's where housing and affordable housing and dense housing creates social connection. We need more places like that.
Because we have a diversity of audience here, could you take a moment just to define what a NORC really is?
Oh,
because
yeah.
I know some people are going to hear this as a amorphous term and say, what the heck is that? And how can I get into one?
What? You don't know what a NORC is? Who doesn't? Yeah, of course. Sorry. I will lapse into age-related lingo from time to time. Thank you for calling me out. So a NORC is a naturally occurring retirement community, which means that it has actually, I'm not sure I know the technical definition, but practically speaking, it has a large concentration of people over the age of 55 or 65. And that is not planned as you might have in a retirement community. It occurs because of the circumstances. And at Co-op City, it has occurred because people move there and they don't leave. So they age in place and create a very sort of dense and socially connected community.
Ken, I want to pivot a little bit to the blue zones. I've been critical of the blue zones since they were first launched. And there seems to be people that either love them or hate them. And I think you went so far as to say your book is the antithesis to the blue zones itself. But I'm wondering, like with everything that's a little amorphous, like a blue zone that might have some bad stuff to it, or maybe looks at correlated relationships over causal ones, what good pieces should we take from it to apply to our communities these days?
Yeah. So I have a love-hate relationship with the concept of blue zones. I think there are lots of questions about data and causation that you described there, which are legitimate criticisms. My bigger challenge with the blue zones and why I ended up wanting to write this book is it's great that people in largely rural, isolated communities like the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica are aging well, but that doesn't have a lot to do, and they don't have a lot in common with our lives, how we live our complex, modern, highly urbanized, sometimes stressful lives. So I wanted to study success in the context of worlds which are relevant to us. That being said, I think some of the lessons that the Blue Zones folks took away from those places are pretty, I think have withstood, most of them have withstood the test of actual data. The importance of movement, I think, being top of the list. The importance of social connection, healthy diet. I mean, those aren't revelatory, but they're right for sure that those things are important to healthy aging. And whether Okinawa has good data or not doesn't really matter. The lessons, I think, are still useful ones and the right ones that we should apply to our own lives.
And they're really foundational just to living a good life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
But it seems like there's been in recent years this rush of people, specifically billionaires, into the longevity space. And I think you and I are relatively on the same mind of this idea that we can just pop a pill and fix something when there hasn't been a lot of evidence behind it, yet people are literally throwing millions and millions of dollars at this to kind of solve for something that may not actually be a problem. Like, where do you see them all fitting into this equation of a good long life?
Yeah. So the Brian Johnsons of the world, perhaps, we're talking about people who want to engineer their bodies and their DNA for live forever. I actually view them not as something new. I view them as a continuation with man's fascination with the idea of the fountain of youth, that we will find some secret, often in water, hidden springs, or some secret mystery of life that we can find and live forever, or live, for much, much longer. And I think that's a fundamental thread that has run through human history. I mean, you can trace it back to, as long as legends go, that people see the limitations of the life we have and want to find a secret to live either much longer, forever. I think they're merely reflective of that desire, dressed up in science. And I think that, once this passes, there'll be some other form of it. And who knows, maybe someone will eventually discover that fountain of youth that will allow someone to live to 150 or 200. I'm just not banking on it for my life or for the life of my friends and family and community.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not betting on it for my life either.
Yeah.
So I think you've made the argument pretty clear here that community and socialization are so vitally important here. So, like, hypothetical here, you have a mayor come to you and say, Ken, you've done this amazing book, you've traveled the world. I have some extra money in my budget this year to build effectively a longevity focused community. What should I invest in first and foremost?
That is a fantastic question. And I would tell the mayor to take a beat and let's think about their community and what they have. But this is a hypothetical. So I think there are a number of things that really impress me about how other countries have built that social health infrastructure. I've already mentioned a couple: the physical layout, housing, the emphasis on intergenerational relationships. I'll mention two more, and actually I'll focus on one for the mayor because it's something that the mayor. One I will not emphasize for the mayor because it's probably outside a mayor's control, which is the importance of work, which you see in Japan, the importance of having purpose, meaning, and social engagement as we age. And it's not just working longer, as everyone in Japan seems to do. It's working differently. It's part-time work. It's flexible hours. It's creating a whole work infrastructure for the second half of life. I won't say that to the mayor because that's probably not something the mayor can implement by himself or herself. I'll instead actually talk about what I saw. I'll tell this Mayor Smith that they should look to South Korea, which has built up which has invented essentially the concept of lifelong learning as a element of social health and healthy longevity. So in Korea, that right to lifelong learning is in their constitution, and the country has implemented it in a number of different ways. The most relevant to this conversation is virtually every city in the country and every major city in the country now have been earned the designation being a lifelong learning city, which means they've set up lifelong learning institutes. They've created curriculum for all ages, but specifically for older generations. Most of them have created classrooms, lifelong learning classrooms in every neighborhood within 5-minute walk. And they've essentially created a culture in virtually every Korean city that learning is something you do that doesn't stop at the age of 21 or 18 or 25. It's something you need for your own health and for your own economic vitality throughout your life. And I think that's something a mayor could easily try to create, as hundreds of mayors have done in South Korea.
And we certainly have some of the basic infrastructure in place for it already, whether it be the public library system or community colleges. So it could, in fact, be relatively low cost and turnkey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's interesting is like there are elements of virtually everything I saw overseas here in the United States, but they are often disconnected, unknown to the public, and not really in the culture. So in lifelong learning, you say the community colleges are Many states provide either reduced or free tuition to their public universities for people over the age of 60. There's something called the OLLIs, the Osher Lifelong Institutes, which are, I think, associated with 100 colleges around the country, including a couple here in the Washington, D.C. area. There are actually those opportunities, but they're underfunded, they're unknown, they're disconnected, and there's not a culture here. People say they want to be lifelong learners. They don't know how to do it. So they default to what they say, reading alone or watching the news, which is a recipe these days for heart disease, not healthy aging. So
yeah, maybe a little mental illness as well if you
exactly.
link too hard into it. So Ken, I want to pivot to a bit of what's coming, because we are running up against a number of different crises right now. And I certainly don't want to alarm listeners here, but this is reality. The Social Security and Medicare funds are nearing their point of insolvency within the next 10 years. We're also presented with this brand new demographic crisis driven by immigration policy, where the United States may stop growing by 2031, really reducing the number of tax-paying people feeding into the system. A lot's going to have to change in order to either make these programs solvent or reframe them for the future. And many of these programs, too, are quite old, 80 to nearly 100 years old for some of these programs. Where do you see the pivots coming in public policy that make sense? And if those pivots don't come because of our hyper-partisan politics these days, what can individuals be doing now to prepare for a future where healthcare might cost more, there might be fewer people to pay taxes to support services, and they might not be getting as big of a check from their Social Security?
Yeah, so that's a pretty dystopian future you just described there, Bradley.
Worst case scenario, right? Worst case scenario.
Yeah, it's dystopian, but probably accurate, right? So the Social Security fund will not be able to pay out full retirement benefits come, I think, 2032 now, maybe it's 2033. But it's not very far away. And I think you're right to question whether our political processes are effective enough to deal with a problem that people see coming now for 20 years. I think the most important thing that's going to happen is we're going to have to redefine the question of who works and when they work, because we're going to be a much older nation, and to afford these systems, you're going to have people working longer. A lot of countries have tried to engineer that by change in the rules of retirement, and those things don't really work when they're top-down solutions. People go on into the streets of Paris and burn garbage cans and turn over trucks when those happen. The countries that have actually successfully sort of pushed down the age curve in terms of pushing out work later are the ones who have realized on a cultural level, not on the political level, on the cultural level, the rules of work that we've inherited for often bad reasons don't really apply when the average life expectancy is 80 or 85, or as in Japan, where the median life expectancy for a woman now is 90, that people should work longer. And it is important for them for their own health. People in Japan, which is both the longest lived and the longest working country, work longer for two reasons. One is that the public associates work with healthy aging and social connection. That's where people have their social communities. Why would you stop when they're most important to you? And the second reason is they've continued to want to work because the systems have been created to allow them to work in different ways. Part-time work, flexible work, work that is very different from the stressful work in Japan that people experience when they're in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
So, Ken, if work is so vitally important for people to remain socially connected and, of course, have an income during this period of pretty disruptive change, both to the economy and society, how do you really think we can start doing that? Is that a public sector solution or more of a private sector one, or maybe a hybrid of the two?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to come from all sides, but it starts, I think, with the social realization of the importance of work, the importance of all the things that are associated with work. The fact that you by and large have to leave your house and get out and move, the fact that you're dealing with a community of people every day, how important the fact you have a purpose. I mean, most people have organized most of their lives around work, and then they just stop. And it's not surprising that often leads to loss of community, loss of social networks, loneliness, a sense of a loss of purpose, and poor health as a result. So I think we have to understand the importance of those work communities to our good health. That's a social issue. But I think then companies and governments need to come together to understand that the work needs of an older workforce, which is what we have, is going to be different than one that is primarily in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And that means more flexible work, the use of the assistive technology, and other things that will allow people to work into their 60s, 70s, sometimes even 80s in ways that is on their terms, not the terms that are set by companies.
Right. So I've never met a politician, especially, in a liberal democracy, that doesn't love to measure things. And I'm wondering how you might propose we measure some of this, let's call it social fitness for the country. Like, is it going to be a mix of economic and health related outcomes, or how do you envision that?
So let's actually start where we are, because we haven't actually talked, Bradley, about how far we are behind as a country in terms of healthy aging. I think people understand, I think at some level, that our life expectancy is not as long as some other countries. I don't think they realize how far behind. We're 6-7 years behind most of our peer countries in terms of life expectancy. We're much closer to Belarus and Nicaragua than we are to our peer countries. We're by far, in terms of economically advanced countries, we are by far the shortest lived country. And more importantly, there are actually measures of healthy longevity, which we do even worse, because the average American lives about 12 years in poor health, compared to 10 in places like Singapore, 9 in China. So by the time you actually add those things up together, we're almost a decade behind a place like Japan. And if you think sort of as I do, that sort of healthy life expectancy, how many years we live in good health as a fundamental measure of how we're doing in society, we're doing pretty damn crappy. I think that's the technical term.
I think it certainly resonates.
Yeah. So I think, that is a place where we can start by thinking about healthy longevity as a measure of how well we're doing as a community in this country. The second thing, of course, is to the question you asked me last, Bradley, which is the economics of a much older labor force and much older population is pretty darn challenging, especially with the U.S. was actually better off for a long time than many other countries because we had such a large influx of immigrants who by and large are much younger. And that created a much more balanced labor force. Presto changeo, a new president and new/old president has really changed that equation, and not for the better. So we are all of a sudden in a very significant challenge around our future labor force. So I think having metrics about understanding what it will take to have a labor force that can keep growing the economy and pay for the cost of longer retirements are going to be a fundamental measure of how we're doing. And those things are actually quite measurable. And we have a long way to go given the sudden changes in our age profile that we need to start dealing with right now. And I think you'll see companies start feeling the pain of it first. In Japan, which I write about in terms of in my book about the challenge, went very quickly from a very significant upper out approach to employment, where everyone essentially was forced out after age, I think 55 or 60, about 60, to one which embraced older workers very quickly because the labor shortages and age profile of the country changed so fast that companies have had to react inside a generation, which is a very, very, very short time in the grand scheme of things.
Ken, to end on a question that's maybe a bit more positive and maybe a bit more action oriented for the individual, John and Jane Q. American, Given everything that you've lived in terms of your lived experience and learned in terms of your travel and your work with Stanford and writing this book, what 3 things would you tell the average person today, maybe in midlife, that they should do immediately to pivot their lives and get them to those next 40 or 50 years?
Yeah. So I would start number one, and I write around this book. So I'll tell if I could, just a slightly discursive story. So one of the experiences I had in the book was actually in between my travels. So I went off to Asia for 2 months. I came back before I went off to Europe for another month and a half. And while I was back for a couple of weeks, trying to make my family remember who I was, we went to a wedding of the daughter and now son-in-law of a friend. And at the wedding, we were signed, as I see everyone, we were signed this table 23, which turned out to be the old folks table. Everyone at the table was 60 or 65, and everyone was thinking about retirement. And the stars of the table were the people who were retiring. And it was clear to me. So the duality of it was, in the main, sort of the young folks who were getting married, were talking about all their big plans for the future. Jobs, family, homes, travel, big, broad agenda, which they were planning out, looking forward to. And our table, people were talking about, well, they weren't really talking about anything, because they had they knew they were retiring, and they were viewing that as times to wind down. So they talked about reading during the day. And to my mind, at 62, I think I have, at the very least, a runway of 20, 30 years. And I intend to encourage everyone else to have the same ambition for those next 20, 30 years as you did when you were 30 or 40. When I was early in my career and earlier in my life and early in my family, I took the sense of what the future could be very seriously. And there's no reason, I think, that we should treat the years of 60s and 70s and 80s any differently. Those can be years of productivity, value, and meaning if you plan for it. So that's one, plan for it. Number two, I think our life course has changed and our demographic profile has changed. We're very conditioned to think of sort of the years after 65 as necessarily years of decline. They don't have to be, and for a lot of people, they won't be. But the more you associate with decline, the more likely you're going to get your wish. So one is to get rid of some of the ageist assumptions we have about the second half of life and look at all the extraordinary things that people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, now even to their hundreds are doing, and understand that's the possibility for you. And the third is, I would say, on a broad level, I would say, look at the assumptions about when things are quote unquote supposed to end, and say those are wrong. There's no reason learning has to end at 18 or 21 or 25. There's no reason there's only historical and often bad reasons why work has to stop at 60 or 65. We've inherited a lot of assumptions about how we're supposed to live our lives. There's no reason that people should wander off and live in a retirement community away from other generations. Those are artifices of the 20th century, and they don't have to be artifices of your life. So I would say challenge the assumptions about the future, and your future will probably be better as a result.
Well, Ken, it's a great book, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for opening our eyes to the world.
Thank you for having me on the podcast, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Getting older doesn't have to scare us. And if we make actions today to improve our social connectedness, think about improving and extending our working lives, and of course, rethinking the way our community is designed, we can get there. I've included links to Ken's book in the show notes below. And of course, if you want to continue on this journey with me and Population Next, like and subscribe. And of course, if you want to follow for more detailed analysis on our demographic future, visit me at populationnext.com. That's populationnext.com. Thanks again for joining.